All right. So tonight we're going to be covering the Maccabean Revolt. So last week, a lot of what we covered was the time period of the Greeks coming in. We did go through Daniel chapter 11 and talked about how that was fulfilled in detail throughout this whole time. And so that kind of covered past already where we are today. It did not record, unfortunately. 5 minutes in, it clocked out because we ran out of memory on the card. And so, but do realize that it's almost the same as the last lesson of the Old Testament backgrounds class. So if you want to cover the material, you can do that. I was just going to shut the door right as Linda's coming. So she'd get mad at me if I shut it on her.
Did you already start?
Yep, we already started.
No, you didn't.
Yes, we did, because you're late. It's already 6:18 on my clock here.
What?
I tell you. All right, so is your hubby still coming too, or can I shut the door on?
No, he's not feeling well.
All right. I'm going to shut the door so you guys can... All right.
What? Oh, papers.
So what we're going to be talking about, there you go, is the Maccabean Revolt. And how many of you guys have ever read First or Second Maccabees? You guys ever read that one? Okay. How many of you guys have heard of the Maccabean Revolt? Okay. How many of you would say you know basically what happened? Okay, good. This is the interesting thing about the Maccabean Revolt is amongst Protestant Americans, we tend to know very little about this. And actually, I should narrow it down. Amongst the people in the Baptist denominations within America, especially the strongly dispensational churches, we tend to know very little about the Maccabean Revolt in the intertestamental period. I did not even hear about it till I was well into adulthood that I was told about it. And there are times where I've heard people talk and even preach as though it never happened. For instance, I had one pastor I had that one time shared and said, yes, the Jews had been, under the thumb of various empires from the time of Babylon on, and they never had a time of freedom where they owned land. No. There's an entire huge long period here of 150 years at least where they were independent. And we're going to see that as we study through. And that's why some of this is important, because that particular sermon was when there was this prophecy of the restoration of Israel in a time when you would again have Jerusalem and you would again be selling and buying land. And some of that was actually fulfilled during this time. But if you're not aware of that, you're going to think it's some future thing still and wasn't talking until like 1950 or something like that. Is that a raising hand or just... Okay. So, what's happening at this time of the Maccabean Revolt? First thing we have is the political situation is... In Judea, actually throughout the entire world at this time, you don't have countries like you and I typically think of countries, where you have a border and they have control of that land, and you could put a marker at the different roads you've now entered this country. That's what we have nowadays. When you've passed in from Canada into the U.S. and so on and so forth. Instead, what you have is a number of city-states that would ally themselves together and submit to similar kings and rulers and so on and so forth, but especially within the area that the Greeks had conquered, they pushed the Greek culture, which was democracy. And so they would establish a number of cities, and each of those cities would have a ecclesia, or a voting body of citizens that we talked a little bit about last week. And they would be the ones who are making decisions about the city. Doesn't mean that there's no king. I mean, as you read about the Greeks, you have King Leonidas who fought against the Persians and stuff. There still can be kings, but there's still a democracy, and there's still other ways that they vote. And a lot of the cities all throughout Israel, Judea, and such at this time, they are either Greek cities, Syrian cities, Jewish cities, and there's different other ones. And it's pretty much whoever is the majority in the city, they kind of make up the control of that city. And so scattered throughout the land of Judea and Samaria and what we would think of as Israel, you have all of these different cities that Jews could be like in control of this city. The next city over, they're not. It's the Syrians. And then the next city past that, it's the Jews. So there's no territory. And there's just trade agreements that are happening. Jerusalem at this point, because you remember last week we talked about how Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem. The high priest went out to meet him. He gave them a great deal of freedoms. And what that city Jerusalem became, was a temple state. Because it was known for the temple and the worship of Yahweh, and it was dedicated to Him, then they allowed it to exist as an independent entity. And the main way that the Greeks were over them was taxation. But a lot of the decisions that had to be made, a lot of governing of the city, was done by the high priest. Now, the people typically would like to choose the high priest, but it depended on the Greek ruler during this time period. Some would let the people choose who the high priest was. Others, for a price, appointed the high priest. And so here, you can see here the one thing I want to point out where it says the Greek ekklesia was used to refer to the voting bodies in the cities. This is the word that we translate church into English. The word church, anybody know where that comes from in the English language? How many of you guys have learned Spanish? The word for Spanish is what? The word for church in Spanish is what? Iglesia, which is obviously straight from ecclesia. Okay, so why do we not have something like that in English? Why is it that we call it church? In the German, the word Kyriakos, which is a referral to the Lord's Day. It's only used in Book of Revelation when John says he was on the island of Patmos on the Lord's Day, which would be on Kyriakos. And the Germans began to use Kyriakos as, and that became church, and that's how that came over into the English, and we now say church. But we're actually saying the Lord's Day. We're not referring to the church, technically, in that. And so ecclesia, which we refer to as the church, this is a term that is used all throughout the Maccabees, and it's used all throughout the Greek version of the Old Testament. So whenever the Israelites were gathered out and brought out together, like when they gathered to read the law, and then when they called out the elders and stuff like that, there was the ecclesia of Israel. And I bring this out because it shows how the Greek word was already present within the culture, so that when Jesus, out of the clear blue, says, "Upon this rock I'll build my church," I mean, that's the first time in the New Testament it's being used, and yet there was a meaning behind it. They knew what they were talking about, that this is His people that were going to be called out. And it does mean called out. There's actually a lot of debate among scholars whether we should take it so literally as just called out, or whether it's just this group of people that are there. Either which way, theologically it becomes important, because I've heard pastors or teachers say, the church is never mentioned in the Old Testament. Well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean because the word ecclesia in the Greek language is mentioned a bunch of times in the Old Testament. So in that sense, it would be mentioned in the Old Testament. But what are you talking about? And if you're saying, well, if you're talking about even the group of Gentiles and stuff joining, that's actually prophesied in the Old Testament. So in many ways, the church actually is mentioned all throughout the Old Testament. It's just if you read it in your English, you're not going to, because in the Old Testament, they translate it as the congregation. And in the New Testament, they translate it as church. It's just the same word, but because they're translating Hebrew in the Old Testament, and they don't go from the Greek. So, anyways, that being said, the Greek control, as I brought up, was primarily exercised through taxation, and then the positions of authority were often bought from them, especially if they were in need of money. So in Judea, as we talked about, the cities, they would be scattered throughout. Jerusalem would kind of be the center of the Jewish culture, but there would be cities all throughout the area. So there were places up in Galilee, there were places around Judea, up around Samaria, where Jews were living. Even today, you think of how they're doing settlements on the West Bank, right? And so they're just putting settlements into there, and they have the people, even though it's technically like under the control of somebody else, you have a Jewish settlement there creating kind of an anchor there. And so like that, you had Jewish settlements all around here. Some that, if the population was more Jewish, then they had control of that city. And so Greeks, Syrians at this point are from the Seleucid Empire, but they're also related to the Arameans of the Old Testament. And so with the Arameans of the Old Testament, you have, they spoke, anyone want to take a guess? Aramaic. Now, when the Jews had come back from Babylon, they had in Babylon actually spoken primarily Aramaic, and Aramaic was one of the primary languages. And it's different enough from Hebrew that when they come back under Ezra, Ezra has to actually interpret the Hebrew and explain its meaning some, because the Aramaic is enough different from the Hebrew. And Aramaic was spoken through these regions a great deal until Alexander came through. And then when Alexander came through, Aramaic fell off in a lot of places, and Greek ends up being spoken. So in the area of Galilee, especially up in this area, that was Samaria and such, they absorbed the Greek culture more readily than in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was where you had the Hasidim and the ones that were trying to be pure Jew. They did not absorb the Greek culture as quickly, but they still did. But up in Galilee, they absorbed it a lot and switched to speaking primarily Greek, to the point that eventually, by like about 200, many of them are only speaking Greek, 200 BC. And so there's debate as to how much that impacted Jerusalem, but this is also why Galilee is referred to as Galilee of the Gentiles. Can anything good come out of that area? It's looked down upon because it's been more Hellenized than the other areas of Judea. So then you have a persecution that arises. While they were under the Greeks, the entire time they were not persecuted. They were under heavy taxation, but that was kind of the norm everywhere you lived. You would be under some sort of taxation. But with Antiochus Epiphanes, we now have a direct persecution. If you guys remember from last week, when Antiochus Epiphanes went to Egypt and he was going to try to conquer Egypt, and Rome met him and said, nope, you cannot come into Egypt. Rome does not want you to do that. And Antiochus Epiphanes, knowing the power of Rome, realized, I can't go in. And so he turns around and heads back. The Jews had received a rumor saying that he had died and was killed in Egypt. So they celebrated, and when he found out, he comes back to Jerusalem and he punishes Jerusalem. The Jews had kicked out the choice of high priest that he had made and put somebody in that they wanted instead. And he came back through and kicked out the other guy, put his guy back in, and then he ends up going through and basically plundering the city. Now, the first time he does this, he's on his way back through, and he's mad, and he goes through and he plunders and demands things and takes people captive and so on and so forth. But then 2 years later, he comes back to plunder Jerusalem again. This time because he's aware of how much gold is in the temple. And when he comes this second time, he comes and he plunders everything. He goes into the storehouse, he takes the temple articles, he takes their curtains, he takes everything out of the temple and just lays it bare. And he then builds an altar on top of their altar and makes them sacrifice pigs on that altar. And some accounts have him setting up a statue of Zeus. He takes 10,000 Jews captive, and then he takes the finest buildings in Jerusalem and he burns them. And then he tears down all the walls around the city so that they have no protection, and he leaves. But the people he leaves in charge, he instructs them that the Jews are not allowed to circumcise their kids. They are not allowed to have books of the law. So this is kind of one of the first times we see an asserted effort to gather up books of the law and burn them and get rid of them. And if you're found honoring these things, then you are going to be punished. So during this as well, there is a forced Hellenization. So in other words, it's not just you can't exercise your culture, but we're going to force our culture on you. Circumcision, as we said, is forbidden. Teaching and obeying the Jewish laws are forbidden. Like we said, the copies of the laws are burned. And then they are forced to worship Greek gods. So they have to build altars, they have to make these sacrifices to the Greek gods, and if you didn't comply, you were put to death. Now, what's important to grasp is, as they went through Judea doing this, most did it. Most did what they were saying. It was just one family that ends up standing against them and not going along with it. Now, at this point, the Samaritans react in a particular way that also helps us understand some of the angst against the Samaritans in the New Testament. If you'll remember, when Alexander the Great came in, the Samaritans went to him and said, hey, we're Jewish too. We're part of this worship of this God that did all this special stuff for you and said that you would defeat the Persians. And then Alexander the Great helped build a temple for them as well to honor God on Mount Gerizim. And they're worshiping at Mount Gerizim. And then they actually took some of the priestly families out of Jerusalem to become priests there. And they were trying to bring a lot of the Jews to worship there as well as at Jerusalem, because that brought in money. It brought in different goods for them. Now, when this persecution begins, the Samaritans are like, oh, well, we're not Jewish. That's not, we're not like that. And they readily switched over to the worship of Zeus on Mount Gerizim. And so that quick abandoning of that is part of another reason why the Jews had a lot of angst towards them. And then they pick up that Hellenization. Now, this forced Hellenization that's going through is actually pretty effective on a lot of people. Realize before this forced Hellenization ever started, there's already been over about 200, let me see here, so 325 to 165, that's not quite 200, but more than 150. So more than 150 years of Greek culture saturating the area already. So they've already become very Greek. They already, have a lot of the Greek language spoken. They've become very Greek in culture. The forced Hellenization pushes it that far. Most gave into that. And I'm saying that to help us realize, even though the Jews stand up and they're like, we're going to be holy and we're the Hasidim, which is going to eventually become the Pharisees and the Sadducees, even though they stand up and they do that, they're already very Greek by the time they do that. And this, again, goes back to the people saying, we got to get to the Jewishness of Jesus. The Judaism of the first century looks almost nothing like the Judaism that went into Babylon. There's almost no correspondence between those two. And the Judaism we see today has actually very little to do with the Judaism of the first century, because it was greatly shaped by the destruction of the temple and the realignment with no temple worship that the Jews had to go through under just the Pharisaic tradition. So that's a caution to us, as in the modern world we have people like, we got to get back to the Jewishness of Jesus. So let's go to the Talmud and let's study that and figure out how Jesus was thinking. No, Jesus was not thinking like the Talmud was. That was not a teaching that he was in any way influenced by. Even Paul was not influenced by that nearly as much as by the vision he had straight from God after he got saved. That kind of impacted him a little bit more. And so it's important for us to know that, to weigh stuff that's being said to us today. So the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes was predicted in Daniel 8. You guys have here in this sheet, did you guys get the copy of this? Anyone not get one of these? Okay. This is just kind of Daniel 8, similar to what I handed you guys last week of Daniel 11, where in the parentheses and stuff, it's trying to help you guys see how during this time of persecution, this prophecy was fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, what's amazing is how specifically this prophecy was fulfilled. So much so that the Jews at that time knew it was being fulfilled and could trust that it was, and it showed God's sovereignty. And the amount of time that they predict even comes about to be accurate. So the persecution, without the prophecy of Daniel to help them, the persecution would have been very difficult because it would have seemed totally contrary to his promise that he was going to reestablish Jerusalem. And so it would have been very discouraging to them on that side. It also was different than and contrary to the other prophecies that were, again, as I started out at the beginning, there are prophecies saying, I'm going to restore Jerusalem. You're once again going to be owning land. You're once again going to be doing this. And it's all these prophecies of what they're going to be doing in Jerusalem. And what's happening here in this time period does not seem to be fulfilling that. And then its detailed prediction made clear it was in God's plan. So once, especially this went through, this persecution was completed and done, they looked at it and it would have been amazing to see how specifically Daniel was fulfilled at that time. And then the prophecy clearly spoke of an end of the time of persecution. So even while they were going through it, they would be able to see the end that's coming. Now, if we look at the handout from Daniel 8, it talks about the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. And I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram. Now, the ram is representative of Persia, and you go through and it talks about a goat, and that's going to be representative of Greece. You're going to see the way, and I'm not going to read through all of this. You guys can kind of go through and see that. You have the conspicuous horn and the four horns being broken off, and another one coming up. So the four horns being broken off, like the Alexander the Great, same thing as the Daniel prophecy with the leopard with the four wings. So you can tell this is talking about the Greeks. So the Jews at that time, they already knew this was the Greeks because they took Daniel's prophecy and went to Alexander and said, look, you're fulfilling this. So the Jews at this time would have known this was being fulfilled. And this boasting horn that comes up is Alexander the Great. See here. Go to verse 9. Out of one of them, Seleucus, came a little horn, which is going to be Antiochus the fourth Epiphany, which grew exceedingly great toward the south. Babylon, which is south of Syria, the center of the Seleucid kingdom, and he had gone down into that area and conquered and got strong that way. And then toward the east, Persia and Bactria, and toward the glorious land. So he first expanded his kingdom out to the east, and then Antiochus Epiphanes came back to where Israel was. And it grew great even to the hosts of heaven. And so Epiphanes, the surname given to Antiochus, means manifestation because he saw himself as an earthly manifestation of Zeus. And some of the hosts and of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. Now, this is an interesting line here because it factors into some of what we see in the book of Revelation when it talks about the dragon sweeping the stars from heaven. Okay, when it says here, and some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them, this refers to the Hellenization done by the Greeks, either in how it overcame the gods of the cultures it conquered, thus hosts and stars referring to the lesser gods, or in the fact that it caused many Jews to fall away, thus the hosts and stars refer to the people of God. So when it says here, this host, the stars in heaven, those are the two possible interpretations here in Daniel. It's talking about the hosts of heaven being the fact that the Greeks went into Syria and took down the Syrian gods, took down the Babylonian gods, could be that. But others interpret it as the stars are actually talking about the Jews, and they were the God's people, and they were the ones that were being trampled. Where this factors into Revelation is in that passage in Revelation 12 where the dragon sweeps the stars from the heavens. It says he hurls them to the ground. So it's not a picture of him, getting all of his buddies to join him from heaven and come with him. The stars that he's sweeping from the heavens are being done so from the wording unwillingly, and or he's forcing them to do it or getting them to go. So that's where that can factor in. Now, I'm not saying that suddenly clears it up and we know exactly who it is. I'm just saying this has to factor into your interpretation of Revelation 12, however you go about it, because that passage in Revelation is highly dependent upon the figurative language of Daniel for us to be able to interpret it. And so you go through this, and again, because of the way it flows in the Antiochus Epiphanes fulfillment, this would definitely seem, and I lean towards myself, that this is actually talking about the Jews who were taken and fallen away and forced to go apostate. Verse 11, it became great, even as great as the prince of the hosts. Where it says, this refers to God or Christ. In other words, he became great, in the land, and forcing that, and so that everyone was honoring him as much as they were honoring God. And the regular burnt offerings was taken away from him. And this is talking about being taken away from God, from the Prince of Hosts. And so this is that interesting thing where the Antiochus Epiphanes forbids the daily offering and sacrifice to God. And so this is like taking away the offering from the Prince of the Hosts, which would seem, to be God. And the reason why I say Christ is because Prince of the Host seems to be like saying like the angel of the Lord, or not just like Yahweh, but actually some other way of seeing him. And the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. This refers to Antiochus the fourth plundered the temple, taking everything in it. And a host, this is referring to the Jews, will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings because of transgression. So this is likely referring to the large number of Jews who were influenced by the Hellenization. And it will throw truth to the ground, so the forbidding the possession of Scripture and forcing them to learn and worship Greek gods, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and giving over the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings." So here, evenings and mornings is probably being used to refer to the fact of the daily sacrifice. You had a morning sacrifice, you had an evening sacrifice. They go evenings and then mornings because of the way the Jews consider the day. The day starts at evening and goes through until the next evening. And if you basically take that number, divide it by 2, and then divide it up into years using the Hebrew calendar, this is almost exactly 3 years. And as we're going to see here, we'll see when we get to the actual the part that's about the temple. It's not on the next slide. We'll see that it was exactly 3 years from the time that the sacrifices were cut off until the day that they were started again. And so this is something that is likely fulfilled almost to the day as they were living through this. And then it says, "Then, after the 2,300 evenings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." And that restoration is what is celebrated at Hanukkah. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. And so the rest of this as it goes through, you guys can read it if you guys have questions, but that's why I gave you the whole handout so you guys can look through. But I wanted you guys to see there's a very specific fulfillment of it as you go through with Antiochus Epiphanes. And that was used by God to encourage the Jews during that time. So what happens during that time, and catch that's like about 3 years from the daily sacrifices ceasing. It's going to be, if we figure about how long it took from the revolt to where they actually cleansed the temple, you got at least almost like a year to a year and a half of just persecution before the revolt actually begins. Part of that is because it begins in a little tiny town of Modin, and so a lot of other larger towns had already been gone to. And what happens at Modin is the king's men come to the town, and they basically are saying, you have to get the elder of the city out here. He has to now sacrifice to Zeus and sacrifice his pig to Zeus. And so when they did that, Mattathias, who was a Levite, he was the elder of the town. He came out and he refused. And when he refused, they took the next guy in line and said, you do it. But Mattathias took a sword and killed that guy, the Jewish guy, not the Greek. And but when he did that, he basically gave a call, a rallying cry to rebel and refuse to do it. And then they did. I think they did end up killing the Greek soldiers that were there, and then they fled into the wilderness. And a lot of people kind of fled with them and rose up too, but many of them did that to the point of just dying. It was just a statement to say that we're standing against this and we won't do it. So Mattathias was a son of Asmoneus, which is why the line of rulers that come from him is called the Hasmonean dynasty. And then, so I already went through that. Yep, so I already did that part. So, with that then, the early stages of the revolt, you have them fleeing to the hills of Judea. So they come from Modin, they go into the area here, same place where David fled from Saul. He's joined by his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. 3 of these, the first 3, will at one point or another rule. Sorry, it's not John. Simon, Judas, and Jonathan rule. The other 2 lose their life in the fighting. When they first start this fighting, they're joined by the Hasidim, and this is the first time we have a mention of the Hasidim. And the Hasidim is a group of Jews who have committed to continue to follow the law and to do it in its original. You might consider them like the conservatives of that time. They weren't giving into all of the cultural influences. And this group is during this time going to slowly develop into 2 parties of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but at this time there's still one party. So the Greek troops pursue them into this area of the hills, and when they pursue them, they first go and attempt to negotiate peace with a compromise. So in other words, you guys are free to come back. You just have to, all you got to do is, worship this, do a sacrifice to Zeus. That's it. To the Greeks, they cannot figure out why this is so hard. Because understand, in the rest of the cultures of that world that weren't monotheistic, if they did an offering to another god, it would not break their commitment to the god they worship. It was just, why couldn't you? I mean, it's just, you have to honor our God because we beat you. And if your God has a problem with it, then he should have helped you not, lose. So you just worship it. And the idea that you would give your life before you would worship another God was nuts to them. It was not unlike when we got into World War II and started fighting against Japan. It's like, why aren't they just surrendering? Why are all these people committing suicide instead of just surrendering to us? They're so fanatical. That's how the Jews were coming across to the Greeks of that time. And so they go out and they're like, hey, look, all you have to do is do this one sacrifice. You don't have to die. But they refuse to do that. When they refuse to do that, the Greeks, knowing the Jews, go, okay, well, we'll take care of this. We're going to attack them on the Sabbath day. Because on the Sabbath day, they can't fight back. And they would literally go to the mouths of the caves where they're hiding and just build fires and big pile of wood, light it, and that fire goes off, sucks all the oxygen out of the cave, suffocates them. And the Jews would not get up and go and fight them off, so they couldn't do that because it was a Sabbath day. And so entire families were dying, and this big question comes up: can we do this on the Sabbath day, or not? Can we fight on the Sabbath day? And they all got together and finally said, we're going to die. We're going to stop existing. That's obviously from Scripture not a plan of God. So we must be able to do this on the Sabbath day. So they permitted fighting on the Sabbath day to protect yourself. So then once they do that and they start to fight back, and they're able to fight on that, now all the zealous people that want to fight come and they gather, and an army starts to build up. Now, when this army builds up, its first focus is not to attack the Greeks. Its first focus is to start killing the Jews who were compromising to Greek culture. Now, when you think about that, I want you guys to get a little bit of an idea how that might have come across to them. You and I have this recent thing in our history of ISIS going across the Middle East and purifying everybody who's not following zealously the law of Islam. That's not drastically unlike what's happening at this point. And I say that because that's how the Greeks were perceiving what was happening and seeing it as that radical. And that's why it made them all the more that they wanted to go and squelch that out. Also, you can see and think about how westernized those people over in Iraq and such were that ISIS was going after. That westernized group would be like these Hellenized groups because they had compromised to this overarching culture that was dominating. And so it's actually not a whole lot unlike that particular circumstance. Except that they're following the correct God. And so when they would go, they would go to the Jews that weren't honoring the Sabbath and weren't following the laws and kill them. And they would take Jewish males and force them to be circumcised. Throughout the Hasmonean time, eventually when they conquer an area, like when they conquered Idumea, which is the Edomites, they forced them to become Jewish and they forced them to all be circumcised. And that's how Herod and his line becomes Jewish in faith. So while they're in this process, about a year into all of this, Mattathias dies. And when he dies, he sets his son Simon over the family. So Simon is kind of the family leader, but Judas is very clearly made the leader of the revolt. How are you guys doing temperature-wise? You want me to go turn the AC up? Are you guys good? Okay. Wait, was that a yes? Turn it up. Yeah. Okay, I'll go turn it up. I'm getting warm, but I'm higher up than you guys are. So, give me a second.
Turn it up, needs one.
We should lock it and not let them back in. Just kidding. So, all right. So, the revolt is not called the Hasmonean revolt. The revolt is called the Maccabean revolt because Judas had a nickname or a surname. Basically, he was named Judas the Hammer, which was Maccabeus. And so they became the Maccabean revolt because he was the first leader of that revolt. The first steps that he had was he succeeded at putting out the Greek forces out of Judea. Now, many of the Greek forces in Judea at this time would have been auxiliary forces. Okay, so again, you think about when we went into the Middle East, we went in and we tried to train up a bunch of people from Iraq to be their police force, to be all those other things. We trained them, and the first line was them, and we were just there supporting them. That's a practice that's been done for millennia. And so many of the people that were there, that were the Greek forces, would be Syrians and others that were not directly Greek in ethnicity all the time. And they would be led by some Greeks, but it would be a mixture of those and more like auxiliary forces. So they first succeed in putting those auxiliary forces out of Judea, which were sometimes less equipped. And then he starts forcing all the Hellenistic Jews to either repent and change or be put to death. What ends up happening then at this point is Apollonius, who was a general in the area of Samaria, but he would have been Samaritan himself, and this is one of those auxiliary forces. He gathers a multinational army against Judas and the Jews. So he is kind of, in a sense, wanting to, show his support for the kingdom and show his support for the Greeks, and raises a force from the Syrians and the Tyrians, the people from up in Lebanon, and others that are there in the area. Realize during this time you still have Canaanites, because you still, like this week we're doing the Canaanite woman that Jesus comes across. So you still have all these different nationalities living in these areas. So he raises an army to go against the Judas, but in raising that, this is not a well-equipped, trained army. This is just something that was raised up, not unlike what Judas does. Judas defeats him and with his forces and keeps his sword, using it the rest of his life, not unlike David and Goliath. Then we have a Seleucid general, Seron, who comes up against them. Now, Seron, when he comes, he has not been ordered to do this by the governor of that area, who would be up in Antioch, farther north. He instead feels this is his opportunity to prove himself and to get ahead by going down and taking care of this situation. And so he puts together a larger force than Apollonius did, but he also then is defeated by Judas. And a lot of times in these battles, in what's happening, Judas is far outnumbered, and this is one of the stranger things about this time period, because it definitely seems that God is working on their side, but he's not doing it miraculously. He seems to be doing it through sovereign actions and indirect things like causing the army to be afraid and fleeing even though they outnumbered them. But there isn't hail falling from heaven or walls just collapsing miraculously. But there does seem to be this sovereignty behind it that's making it happen, but not as directly as when you have like David or Joshua and such. Also, with this time period, with Judah and the leaders, there are some aspects of the way that they're leading that would not seem to be pleasing to God. Whether it's the forcing people to be circumcised and killing them. In some ways, that was in the law. And they followed it at a level that no one had followed it up to that point. And so on that level, you could be there. But there's also ways in which they go into battles, and it's not this direct crying out to God. It's kind of like this just confidence that he's going to be on their side. But it's just hard to read it and go like, wow, this reads like it's David fighting with God on his side. It's very different. So with after those other three were defeated, now Gorgias, who is the more the one that's over the troops in that whole area, the one who's above him is called Lysias, and so Gorgias is the first official reaction from the Greek armies, and he comes against Judea and fights against Judas. Now, does anybody recognize the name Gorgias? Yeah. If you have to, one of the biggest and more well-known writings of Socrates, Plato, is a conversation with Socrates and a Gorgias, not this Gorgias, but with a Gorgias. So it's a pretty well-known Greek name in that sense. So commissioned by Lysias as a royal overseer of Syria, he takes troops from Syria and from the land of the Philistines, so Ashdod and some of those areas, and they go down to attack the Jews, and slave traders just follow them. And this gives us a little bit of a window into some of the slavery of the earlier years. slavery, the greatest source of slavery was battles. It wasn't, you didn't just walk into a particular nation and start kidnapping people for slavery. You would fight a battle, and then those that lost the battle, you would take captive as slaves and sell them. And that's why the slave traders are following them into this battle. It's not that none of them ever kidnapped people, but that was not the main source. And so Judas attacks the enemy camp while a large force is out looking for them. So they're at a camp. They send another a force of like 5,000 to go out and look for them. And they instead go to their camp and attack unexpected. And they defeat that large force of 35,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. And then when the other force returns, they realize they already defeated a much larger force. And so they head out and get out of Dodge. Judah then leads the Jews into the camp, and they plunder the camp. And now their rebellion is supplied. They now have weapons. They now have food and other things that they would need for battle. And so the equipment and the funds help their efforts a great deal. Then you have Lysias himself, who's the governor of that whole area. He comes down a year after they had defeated Gorgias. He has a much larger force than Gorgias did. He had 60,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. And Judas attacks him with just 10,000 and ends up leaving 5,000 of the enemy dead. And Lucius ends up fleeing and figures he's going to come back with a bigger force later rather than try to tackle that. So at this point, when Lysias flees, Judas has been successful, and they are relatively safe from fear of attack for a time period. And when they get to this point, that's when they say, let's go up to the temple and see how the temple is doing. So when they enter Jerusalem and they get to the temple, it's completely desolate. Nobody's there. Everything is been wrecked. Nothing's been taken care of it. No one is caring for it. Whether you see like weeds, you can kind of picture a place that hasn't been cared for in like 2 years, 3 years. And so they begin to clean all of this up. Now, while they're doing this, the Hellenizers and the Hellenized Jews, they obviously were not expecting Judas to be this successful. And some of them have holed up in the Antonian fortress that the Greeks have built right on the Temple Mount. So while they're in the temple and while they're taking Jerusalem, there's actually a group of Greeks living in the Antonian fortress waiting to be delivered by Greek forces at a later time. And so they put a guard around that to keep them from attacking them and to keep anyone from getting out to go to the Greeks to ask for help, because that would have invited problems sooner than what they wanted. Then they go to the altar and they tear down the altar that was there, including, because the Greeks had built an altar on top of the other one, so they just tore down both. And so the other one would have been the altar that was built by Ezra and such. And so they tear that one down and they build an altar with unhewn rocks, which again is a fulfillment of God's command in Scripture that the altar is to be built with unhewn rocks. And so you see them following that law very strictly. And after a period of getting everything cleaned up and everything set, they then renew the daily sacrifices. And this is where both records, both Josephus and the Maccabees, basically say that it was 3 years to the day. Now, 3 years to the day is not 365 times 3 that. It's 3 years to the day in the same day of the month. And the Hebrew months are shorter, and they don't have the leap year like with a day. They have leap months. They just like add a month in here, and it pushes it out and such. So that's why you see more of the flexibility of how long is the year and so on and so forth. So it's different. Don't try to add it up basically with the Roman year that we use now. It won't work. But both of them testify that it was 3 years to the day that those sacrifices began again. Now this is where the legend is that there was a miracle with the lampstand. This is not recorded in First Maccabees, and I'm trying to remember if it's mentioned in Josephus. But basically, when they went to start up the sacrifices and such, they put the lampstand in the temple, and there was not enough oil that had been made clean ceremonially to be used in the lampstand, and the process of making it clean took 8 days. And so what were they going to do? So they just put what oil was left in the lamps and lit them, and as it is said, that oil lasted for all 8 days while the rest was being sanctified to be able to be used, and that was the miracle of the lampstand, and that's why Hanukkah has the lampstand with the menorah with the 8 arms. The one in the temple would have had, so menorah has 9 total, the 8 on the side and the one in the middle. The one in the temple would have had 3 and 1 in the middle, but the reason why they have more with the menorah is because lighting one for each of the 8 days that it was able to go on that oil. And so then once this temple worship is restarted, Judas fortifies Jerusalem and some of the nearby towns, and he gets ready for the Greeks to come back. At this point, then, the neighboring nations... Oops, I forgot to go forward to that, didn't I? I was getting real behind. How come you guys didn't tell me? So the neighboring nations start to be afraid of what's going to happen if these zealots get more control. Understand, they're watching the Jews, kill other Jews who aren't following the law, forcing them to be circumcised, and they're probably already hearing that they're going to force other people to be circumcised. And again, even though it's not the most positive comparison, but it help you get into what it was like for the Hellenizers. It would have been like those that were westernized while ISIS was going through. They're afraid that if they get all control, we're all going to be under Sharia law. We're all going to have to obey that. And so those around them start to really worry what's going to happen if Judas gets too much control, and they see the successes that he has. So in response, they agree to join together and try to wipe out the Jews. This is another place where the angst between the Jews and the other nations gets built up, because now you're seeing Jews you see other nations just simply trying to wipe out the Jews. So there's this increasing, what we now today call anti-Semitism, where there's just a lot more tension with them. And so the Jews begin to flee to certain fortified cities, and they send to Judas for help, because as I said, Jerusalem is there. There's some Jewish cities, and in those Jewish cities, the Jews probably are decently safe. But the Jews in these other cities that are dominated by Syrians or Greeks or whatever, they're the ones that are being rounded up and being taken captive and so on and so forth. And then they're the ones sending to Judas to help. So what Judas does is he goes down first into Idumea, and he sweeps around and comes up through Ammon and Gilead and Galilee, and he is successful as he goes through that area. There are cities that close themselves off to him, and he just comes through anyways, and he is victorious as he goes through there. So he subdues the Edomites, he subdues Ammon, he's victorious in Galilee, and then Judas and Jonathan both take care of subduing Gilead, which is, you can see on the map where that's at. And so there's all this success, but Gorgias, who's coming back then to take them on, goes to Jamnia, and there's a group that's in Jerusalem that Joseph and Azarias, 2 young men in Jerusalem, they want to have some of the glory that Judas is getting and leading the rest of this revolt. So they decide to put together a group from Jerusalem and go attack Gorgias at Jamnia, and basically they lose badly. This goes to bolster Judas's, the idea of Judas being like this anointed leader, this somebody he's the one that God is working with, because when this other group went and tried to attack, they failed. So then Antiochus himself sees that he needs to take care of this. The problem is he doesn't have enough money to build up the army to go after the Jews. And so what he does, he starts campaigning in the east and starts to raid other cities just to build up all of this plunder. And one of the things that he does is he plunders the temple of Diana, which is over in the area of Babylon and what was Elam. And he does that to get some of the funds. Now, later on, when we talk about the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, there are some that attribute it to his raiding of the Temple of Jerusalem, and there are some that attribute it to his raiding of this Temple of Diana. But either which way, his death is attributed to having raided these temples and having disrespected the gods. And this is some of the ways that within the prophecy, when it says that he disrespects any gods and he follows after other gods of fortification and so on and so forth and such, you see he has no respect for any of the gods. He goes and plunders temples left and right to fund his campaigns. So he puts Lucius in charge of the kingdom and the war with the Jews as he goes east. And that's who lost against Judas earlier. And then Antiochus V, who is the one who is in line to be made king, he is with Lysias, and Lysias ends up raising him while Antiochus Epiphanes goes east to raise those funds. So when he goes to take the Temple of Diana, he fails at being able to fully raid it, and he becomes deathly sick and dies. Now Josephus and Maccabees have Antiochus himself saying, "I'm dying because of what I did to the Jews." But seeing that both of them are Jewish, obviously historians don't like to take that without questioning it. And then Antiochus, in his death, gives control of his kingdom to his commander Philip. So his commander Philip is with him. He gives control of that to Philip, and then he says, "Go, get Antiochus V and put Antiochus V on the throne." But Philip has no intention of doing that. Philip plans on taking the kingdom for himself. And this is the beginning of the downfall of the Greek Empire, of the Seleucid Empire. So this begins a series of competition for the Seleucid throne that just results in the empire unraveling. And the Jews, especially when we get to the time where we're going to talk about Jonathan, one of the sons, he just takes the right advantage every time between the rulers, and that's how the Jews expand almost to the size of the kingdom that David and Solomon had. So, the first battle between the Jews and the major contingent of the Syrian army. This time Lysias shows up to Jerusalem. He's got infantry, cavalry, and war elephants. They are petrified when they see this army come up to Jerusalem. The army actually gathers about where Lazarus and Mary and Martha's house was, on that hill on the east side of Jerusalem. And as they come up out of that valley with these elephants, they were scared to death. And so they were routed before them. They hid in the temple area, and then Lysias laid siege to Jerusalem for quite a while. Many sneak out and leave, and in essence, what happens is Judas is left with very few people. At this time, then, news arrives that Philip is returning from the east. So Philip is the commander that Antiochus Epiphanes had put in charge. He's coming from the east, and Antiochus and Lysias need to leave off being in Jerusalem, and they have to return to the capital to contest his claims for the kingdom. So they have to depart from their war with the Jews to settle all that stuff. In their departure, they make a treaty with Judas, and they're allowed and permitted to live according to the law. But then they tear down the walls around Jerusalem, so they can't turn it into a fortification again. But then Menelaus, who is the high priest that the Jews were in favor of, was the high priest that was pushing for the Hellenism. He was put to death for having caused the whole problem in the first place, because he was the one pushing for it and telling them to come. So in the east, Demetrius, who's the nephew of Antiochus Epiphanes, he ends up coming to power. And so in all this contesting the throne, Demetrius now comes in. He had been a hostage in Rome. Do you guys remember talking about hostages back in that day? It's different. He had been sent there to be raised in Rome, but is actually part of a treaty with Rome. And so when he's coming from Rome to take power, he probably has Roman support. And because the Romans are like, hey, it's like if we had somebody from, again, like if somebody from Iraq had come to America and we had educated them at Harvard and they were very westernized, like, great, you're going to be the guy we can put in power over here who's going to favor us, you see? And so in that way, Rome was doing much the same thing at that time. And so he comes back, probably being supported by Rome. And at first he takes control of the coastal city and then takes Antioch. Antioch, if you look at it in Syria, it's not right on the coast, and so there's a port that's associated with it. And that's what he took first. But then when he takes the capital, he's now technically in control, and he has Lucius and Antiochus V captured and slain because he wants to have control. So the Jews, seeing that these two that had made the treaty with them but then left are dead, you have alchemists. They now are under Demetrius, and Demetrius comes, and Alchemist is a Hellenized Jew, descended from Aaron but not from Zadok. And so he goes to Demetrius, offers him a lot of money. I want to be made high priest. And so they depose the other high priest, and now Demetrius makes Alchemist the high priest. His pedigree, because he's at least from the line of Aaron, keeps the Hasidim from being like, no, you can't do that because he's not right. And they actually allow him to become high priest. The problem is, high priest is the ruler of Jerusalem. Remember, it's a temple state. And so that puts him into competition for leadership with Judas, and Judas starts to lose some of his support. Alchemist then comes with Bacchides into Judea to then take out Judas because he sees him as a competitor. Now, it's at this time that Onias, who was a descendant of Zadok. Zadok is the high priestly line that started at the time of David. He flees to Egypt, seeing that he wasn't going to be favored to be high priest. When he gets to Egypt, he's given permission at that time to build a temple for Yahweh in Egypt. And it's interesting when Josephus gives this story. Onias goes to Cleopatra, not the Antony and Cleopatra yet, but this is one of the Cleopatras of history, and Ptolemy, who was king and queen at that time. And he requests to build this temple, and Ptolemy and Cleopatra seem to know enough about Jewish culture to go, is that actually okay? And he goes to Jeremiah, and there's a passage, in Isaiah 19:19. Does anybody have their Bible with them? Did you look up Isaiah 19:19? So he goes to Isaiah 19:19 and shows Ptolemy and Cleopatra this passage and says, see, our prophets prophesy that this will be the case. And so they say, well, you can build the temple then, but the consequences are on you. We're washing our hands of whether this is okay with God because we don't want to be cursed. And so you can do that. And so a temple was built in Egypt that is actually used by some Jews from this point on to worship and tithe and so on and so forth. But it is definitely looked down upon and not favored by most Jews. Most Jews see it as a bastard temple, if you are offended too badly by that word. Who has the passage? Anyone got it yet? Go ahead and read it as loud as you can.
On that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the center of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord near her border.
Okay. No, that's pretty. I mean, you can read it. It's within that whole. Which again, sometimes when you're going through the prophecies in Isaiah, and you'll hit something like this and you're like, what is this even talking about? But this actually allows us to take a prophecy and kind of put it into a historical context and realize that at least some of what's being prophesied there is happening at this time. We don't have time to go through the rest of the prophecy, but you guys can look at Isaiah 19 and see for yourselves. So at this point, Bacchides comes in. He establishes the authority of Alchemists. He kills a lot of the Jews that are part of Judas's group, and then leaves a force behind to protect Alchemists. And then he tries to use this force to gain more control, which was not the purpose for which it was sent. So that gets him a little bit of disfavor with Bacchides. And then Judas ends up prevailing against Alchemists. And so Alchemist sends to Demetrius for more help. When this happens, he sends Nicanor to kill Judas. And they come down, and the first battle in a town outside of Jerusalem is a draw. See, I either favor the screen or these, then I get behind on one or the other. So the first battle comes to a draw, and then he threatens to tear down the temple if they don't turn Judas over. So now this is huge pressure for them to do that. And instead, Judas goes out and just attacks Nicanor's forces and kills Nicanor and is actually successful in that. It's at this time then that Judas is actually made high priest, because they deposed Alchemist, having been this unfit high priest that was appointed by the Greeks. And now because Alchemist showed that he was in favor of the Hellenization, the Hasidim left that support, and having defeated that other force, they go ahead and they make Judas high priest. When they do this, there's a special exception made, because he's not in the line of the high priest. But they understood that having the two leaders was going to cause problems. Now, First Maccabees does not have Judas being made high priest at this point, but Josephus does. At this point, Judas makes a treaty with Rome. And this is what a lot of people don't realize. The first contact the Jews have with Rome is Judas making a friendly treaty with them. And the Romans are more than glad to do that. And this begins a long-standing relationship between the Jews and Rome as allies. And so the Jews and Rome started as allies, and they stay allies for quite a while. You'll see that as we go through all of this. Whereas I think the typical impression is that from the get-go, the Jews and Romans hated each other, and the Romans were always oppressive, and so on and so forth. And that's not at all what is the case. So he sends to Rome. And Rome at this point is getting stronger and stronger and has taken over what is modern day Greece and is getting closer for sure. And they're starting to get into the area of Turkey. We're going to see when we go through the Roman history in just a little bit that the area of Turkey that we see all of the churches of Revelation in, for instance, Ephesus, it's called, we call it Asia Minor, but the eastern side, this was the kingdom of I want to say Lydia, and the king at this time literally gave his kingdom to Rome in his will. So Rome was not conquering everything by military. There were people that saw it as the up and coming, where they came to my mind was classy, but I'm trying to think of trendy is not it either. Civilized, the way to go, I guess is what you say. And so Rome is coming this direction. Now, one real quick interesting note here, and I picked this up, Ben Kwitsky and I are going through Maccabees in the Greek, and we came across a passage in this. When they send to Rome to make this treaty, they also have people stop by Sparta on the way back to make a treaty with them. And in the letter to the people in Sparta, they refer to the Spartans as being from the seed of Abraham. And there's actually a lot of scholarship being done right now to see if there's any reality to that the Spartans could have actually been a Jewish colony that was there in the area of Greece, and that they actually are from the seed of Abraham. Well, wouldn't that be weird? Just, yeah. Anyways, interesting thing there. So he sends representatives to the Senate who confirm a treaty with Rome, and this is basically intended to give Demetrius this hesitancy. You come and you attack us, Rome might get involved somehow. So then, that didn't work a whole lot, because Bacchides is sent to defeat Judas, and his army comes, and it's huge. He comes, he's not taking any risks, and he comes with this massive army. And the entire force with Judas abandons him, and you'd think Judas would be like, well, I guess we got to wait and fight another day. Nope. Judas says, we're going to go out, and with just 800, we're going to fight. And he does fight valiantly, and he dies. And so, in that sense, thus goes the first leader of the Maccabean revolt. This fight to the death really creates a hero out of him. And so a lot of people, memorialize him and looked up to him, and that actually helps almost as much by making him a martyr. And so what we see in Judas's life is that he succeeded in establishing a firm foundation for the freedom of the Jews. We're going to pick up next week with his brother Simon, who takes on after him. And then we saw throughout his battles this great sovereignty of God that happened, but primarily through the fear being cast upon the enemy. And then we see that his decision to make a treaty with Rome sets things into motion that are going to affect things in the years to come after that. All right? Oh, we made it through all that by 7:30. That's a first. So any questions you guys have from this time period? Yes?
What writing was the thing about the Spartans?
That was in Josephus. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. It's in Maccabees. Yeah, I'm using my phone recorder. I'd look it up for you, but I can try to find it. It was it was really interesting because when we were reading through it in the Greek, and it said being likewise from the seed of Abraham. We looked at it and like, huh? Where is this from? It seemed like out of left field, and then he ended up going and researching it some and found that there's probably 3 or 4 scholarly articles that have just come out on that fact of whether or not the Spartans were part of were related to the children of Abraham. So yeah.
Were Josephus and Maccabees written at the same time? Did they have the same stories?
Yeah, no. So Maccabees is written probably. Because it's covering a couple hundred, or about 100 and plus years, I think. I'm trying to think how far the first Maccabees goes. But first and second Maccabees would cover to about 50 years before Christ. Josephus is being written after 70 AD. So you'll get the story again with Josephus, but it's not bad to hear it twice. Josephus was actually the commander of the northern forces against Rome in the war with Rome during the 60, 67, 68, 69. And then right before 70 AD, he's taken captive. When he is taken captive, he prophesies to Vespasian that he will become emperor, and he does. And because he prophesied it and it came true, he honors Josephus. So rather than just being a captive, he actually makes him one of his advisors and stuff like that. And so Josephus becomes very Roman, and he travels with Vespasian and is there actually with Titus. And when they're getting ready to conquer Jerusalem, Josephus is outside the walls saying, "Why just surrender, and then the temple won't be destroyed, Jerusalem won't be destroyed. Why are you guys doing this?" And trying to talk them out of fighting with the Romans. We'll go into some great detail. But because of that, the Jews do not like Josephus. They have a very strong distaste for Josephus and question a lot of his history. However, the history that he has lines up great with the Maccabees. There's almost no disagreement there, and his history. It's not like a perfect history, but it's definitely not straight up lies. And it's just he's so disliked by the Jews that they don't accept it. Any other questions about this time, or I can expand past that? You guys, we got enough time. You guys can ask any question. You guys can get like your own personal forum like we're gonna have in a couple of weeks. But. I feel like we should have Jeopardy music going. So of this time period and what we're talking about, is there anything that we've talked about that struck a greater interest with you?
Well, even though the Maccabees aren't considered an inspired writing, it seems like God was definitely working with Judas and his victories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things I wrestle with is how to view this time period. Couple things with this. These are all things just kind of tossing out there. On one level, what's prophesied in the various prophets points that this is going to happen. So as we see in Daniel, this is being fulfilled. The temple being built, that was in Isaiah. So there's a lot of prophecy being fulfilled. So you see God's sovereignty over it. What you don't see, though, is an actual prophet. Even the Maccabees say there was no prophet at that time. So there's no one really kind of leading that. And then one possible interpretation of, in the book of Revelation, when you have the great dragon, you guys remember that the dragon has, and I'll bring this back up again here. The dragon has a certain number of heads and horns and everything else. If you take a head as being somebody who's a leader, the horn as somebody who actually has authority given to them, and then the crown is those who actually gained royal recognition and were seen as a king. Then the number of leaders and basically the number of heads, horns, and crowns within this line match up with the numbers that are there for the dragon. And the end of this line is here. And it says the dragon was sitting there waiting to consume the child, which almost every person I know sees that prophecy in Revelation as referring to Herod trying to kill Christ when he was a child. So and animals, when we say, when we think of different animals and beasts and stuff in Scripture, as they're used in the apocalyptic stuff, the lion was Babylon, the leopard was Greece. So these different creatures, and then there's the fourth beast that seems to be Rome, but also very different. But then also you have the beast that's in Revelation, and then the beast that the dragon. So the dragon gives his authority to the beast, and the beast has head, horns, and crowns that line up with the emperors from Caesar to Vespasian or Titus, who destroyed the temple. And so that's why when you have people that look at some of that as being fulfilled, back then, because of the fact that the dragon is the one who is doing that. And then after Herod bequeaths, his kingdom ends up going to Rome, and Rome is now the one that has authority over Jerusalem. And so that's why some have taken that view. But if you go that route with an interpretation, then this line of Hasmonean kings was not godly, was not good, and from a heavenly perspective, and so would the question be of like, that this was actually Satan trying to take out the Jewish people by leading them in the wrong direction, or things like that. And, that might not be at all what the dragon and the beast is, period. But when you look at the interpretation of heads, horns, and crowns going from Daniel, that's what it seems to be pointing to, as a kingdom that would have all of those things. Now, I say that with nothing else, make you guys think and realize it's a lot harder to figure out Revelation than we often think. Because they're actually, when we say, we're like, why would anyone think that it was back at this time? Because there actually are a lot of ways that it corresponds that you got to actually wrestle with and say, is it pointing to that? Because no matter what way you look at it, that prophecy in Revelation 12 has to do with the time when Christ comes and there's an attempt on his life, and then he's taken up into heaven. So even within the passage itself, it places it at that time in history. And then you add to all of that, that's actually when Satan is said to fall from heaven, is at the time of Christ, which is very different than what we typically think as well, because we think Satan fell from heaven back at creation, but that's also not anywhere in Scripture either. So, when for you guys, when would you say in your mind you typically have thought Satan was cast out of heaven?
Well, they talk about a people of giants in Genesis.
So the five wills is often applied to him.
What is that in Genesis?
It's in Isaiah 14. Well, this is one of the interesting conversations that I had with my students when we would go over Milton's Paradise Lost, because most of our gut idea of what we think happened with Satan's fall comes from Milton, not from Scripture. That you see him being cast out of heaven, that he's cast into hell, and that he issues out of hell and does his bidding, and that he's got this kingdom in hell, and so on and so forth. That's the typical American perspective of Satan, and that's not biblical at all. If we take hell as the lake of fire and identify Gehenna with that, then nobody's in hell yet. It's actually, there's the Sheol and Hades, which is the grave, and then you have the final Gehenna and hell. And Satan is in neither one of those. He is the god of this world. He's not in Hades or Sheol or hell. He is here. He's prince of the power of the air, and he has not been. That is the lake of fire is prepared for him, but he's not there yet. And his fall, there's a difference between his fall from goodness and his fall from heaven. When you read Job, where's Satan?
He's accusing.
Yeah, he's accusing.
He's at the throne accusing.
He's at the throne of God accusing. So how is he at the throne of God? Like, what in the world? But then what does it say in Revelation? Who has been thrown down? The accuser of our brethren. Why has he been thrown down? Because of the cross. The cross made it so he could no longer stand and accuse us. There was no way to accuse us, and he's now cast out. So that puts him his falling out of heaven, more at the time of the ministry of Christ. And then the only other place where it says that he falls from heaven is when the disciples come back to Jesus and say, we've been casting out demons. And he says, yes, I saw Satan fall from heaven. And so both discussions of Satan falling from heaven are happening at the time of the ministry of Christ. Whereas there's nothing at creation. You have the serpent. There's no warning to Adam and Eve that, watch out for Satan and this enemy who fell and fought this war against us. And or, by the way, there's demons and things like that. None of that is there. And at the end of creation, he says, it's all good. It's very good. And there's no part of creation that's not. So Satan, it would seem at that point, is not fallen. And then when you go to the two passages in the prophets that tend to be interpreted as speaking of Satan, you have the Isaiah 14, which are the 5 I wills, which it's not wrong to attribute to Satan. The thing that makes us attribute that to Satan, however, is the word Lucifer, which people took as, well, that's Satan's name, is Lucifer. Lucifer is just Latin for the morning star. And that's why today in our English versions it's translated as morning star. And that's a prophecy about a particular king who said, I will arise to those things. But there's definitely, probably a similarity with Satan. But that one's actually not as sure that it's talking about Satan at all, because it had more to do with just translating as Lucifer and the way people took that. In Ezekiel, there's a passage that's a prophecy against the king of Tyre, but then there's also a prophecy against the prince of Tyre, and the one about I think it's the one about the prince, not the it's either the prince or anyways. It has him being in Eden, which that's harder to see it just being the human king. So it seems like you've moved to something else. But it has him being in Eden. All the precious jewels were drained. So when you see, when you think of people saying Satan used to be a guardian cherub, that's from the Ezekiel passage. It says you were in Eden, you were a guardian cherub of God, and then fault was found in you. So even there, he was in Eden before fault was found in him. And then, which is why I actually lean toward the fact that his decision to tempt Eve was his fall from goodness. So prior to that, and that's why he's judged with, you have man, Eve, and the serpent all being judged at the same time, with no sense of a pre-history to that. None of that is important doctrinally at all, but it's interesting to talk about because, and the most beneficial thing about the discussion is to sit down and realize how much, if you I love you guys go, I'm like, no, he's got to be wrong. I'm going to go find it. I'd almost love it if you guys do that, because you guys will see how much we thought we knew about Satan that we supposedly thought came from Scripture that came nowhere from Scripture at all. It came from literature and everything else that we've been told, and it's not actually there. And I say that that's important because then it makes us drive us to Scripture and say, how much else do I think is just so biblical, and I'm so sure it's there in Scripture that I'm living by that actually isn't. So anyways, I found a way to fill the time. See, I always have a way to fill the time. All right, any last questions? Otherwise, I'll let you guys go. Yes?
So who was the serpent?
So the serpent is a very good question as to the serpent and such. Some of that's a mystery. The other thing is the idea that all the demons all fell at once, whereas what it seems is that they're actually falling over time. In that during that time period, you had sons of God that were abandoning their place in heaven as they made relationships with people. There's ways that corresponds with some of the pagan myths that's really intriguing. We talked a little bit about that back when we did Genesis and stuff. But yeah, that there's that concept that it's not one big false swoop that they all...
That's non-Christians' favorite thing to say is, why was the serpent there?
Yeah.
What was the serpent doing in this perfect creation?
Yeah. And I feel in God's wisdom, the serpent had his role. In other words, God created creatures that weren't evil, but he created a circumstance where they were genuinely free, and that they would exercise that freedom in a direction that he knew would allow him to fulfill his plan. Because the fall is most definitely something that God knew would happen, but factored into his plan. But he couldn't be the author of it or the cause of it. And so his wisdom was so great, he was able to create it so that he wasn't the author of it, but fully permitted it so he could use it to glorify his name and show us his love by having a process of redemption. So
I'm a little slow. So Satan, the serpent was not Satan?
when you say
I'm really slow.
just the very first time that the serpent and Satan are identified together is Revelation 12. So I'm not saying it's not.
So not Genesis 3:1.
Genesis 3:1 does not refer to the serpent as Satan in any way.
Doesn't John identify him?
Just in Revelation 12.
Oh, okay. Well, no.
So and Satan
But isn't
Satan is the Hebrew word Satan means adversary. 50% of the time that the word Satan occurs in Hebrew, it's talking of a human adversary. And so, as you're reading in Hebrew, it's the context that tells you this is a spiritual adversary or a human adversary. And so that's why, when it says Satan arose and caused David to count his men, and they translate it that way, and then you have the Chronicles version, in the other, because Chronicles and Kings parallel each other, the other one says that God, got David to count his men. So how is it that Satan got him to count his men, but God got him to count his men? Well, God got him to count his men by letting a human adversary, namely, he's actually named just a little bit after that as the king of Ammon. And God raises up a human adversary and to test David to see whether he would count his men. So that's how it's God, but the adversary is not Satan there, it's a man. But that's one of the places where, for instance, the context led some English translator to put Satan, which makes us go with the devil. In the Old Testament, the word Satan, only in Job and in Zechariah do you have Hasatan, which would be like the adversary. And in Job, that's why in Job, clearly a heavenly being, he's in heaven, and he's the adversary. In Zechariah, it's when the adversary is accusing Joshua, the high priest, before the throne of God. So the only time you see the adversary referred to, he's actually in heaven directly accusing somebody, either Joshua or Job. And that's why in the end, the adversary, the accuser, is thrown down because of the cross. Other times you read Satan, it's actually referring to an enemy corporately, not always an individual. That's not to say there is no individual, but it's not quite the way we always think of it. Is like here's Satan and Satan's doing all this stuff. It's like no, there's an entire adversary and enemy that we have that's as varied as the gods were at that time, because I believe there were spiritual realities behind those gods, and that was the adversary as a whole. And so it's just way more complex than what we think. And we often feel that we've gotten it down, but that's the person who felt we got it down was Milton, and he's the one who lays it all out and claims a certain level of inspiration, but he was not inspired. So, all right. I could do this all night, but we'll all right, we'll go ahead and finish up. I'll close in prayer, and then you guys can head out. If you guys have more questions, I'll hang out though. Heavenly Father, I just I thank you for your word that you've given us, and as we go through this history that helps us understand the New Testament better, and as we just talk about some of this fun stuff in between, that Lord, you would just drive us to your word to make sure we know it and not just a bunch of stuff, and that we let our minds and our picture of reality be shaped by what you've revealed to us, and that we trust it and allow it to determine our truth for us, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray.